In 1996, Hollywood studios burned through over $300 million on 15 films that audiences simply refused to watch. That is not a typo. And the wildest part is that some of these disasters starred the biggest names in the industry, from Oscar winners to the most bankable action stars on the planet. But that is just the beginning, because behind each of these flops is a story of ego, bad timing, and decisions so baffling they still get talked about almost 30 years later. From a director who got fired and snuck back onto his own set in disguise, to a basketball legend who collected $7 million to play a genie, these are the 15 biggest box office disasters of 1996. And the real stories Hollywood tried to bury. Carpool kicked off what might be the worst year any single actor has ever had in Hollywood. Tom Arnold starred in this Warner Brothers comedy about a bumbling dad forced into a wild ride across the city. The studio spent $17 million making it. It earned $3.3 million back. That is not a rounding error. That is a catastrophe. Warner Brothers refused to screen it for critics before opening day, which is basically the studio equivalent of hiding your report card. It opened at number 13 and vanished. But here's the thing about Tom Arnold in 1996. Carpool was not even his biggest disaster that year. He had two more coming, and combined, his three 1996 films lost roughly $49 million on $57 million in production costs. One critic wrote that watching a Tom Arnold movie was like being trapped in a room with a barking dog for 90 minutes, which honestly feels generous. Celtic Pride is the rare sports comedy that managed to offend both basketball fans and comedy fans simultaneously. Released in April 1996 through Disney's Hollywood Pictures label, the film starred Daniel Stern and Dan Aykroyd as two obsessive Boston Celtics fans who take drastic measures to keep an opposing star player from competing in Game 7. The budget sat around $15 to $20 million. It pulled in roughly $9 million. But the real story here is not the money. It is the screenwriters. One of them was a young guy named Judd Apatow, years before he became the comedy kingpin behind Knocked Up and The 40-Year-Old Virgin. The basketball scenes were filmed at the historic Boston Garden right before it was torn down, and the closing credits show demolition footage. According to industry reports, Bill Murray saw this film and has refused to take a role from Apatow ever since. The Stupids was supposed to be a family comedy. Instead, it became proof that even a legendary director can completely lose the plot. John Landis, the man behind Animal House, The Blues Brothers, and Trading Places, directed Tom Arnold in an adaptation of a beloved children's book series. The studio spent $25 million. Worldwide gross came to $3.4 million. That means the film earned back roughly 10% of what it cost to produce, which is insane when you think about it. Entertainment Weekly gave it a rare F grade and called it guaranteed 100% laugh-free. Sir Christopher Lee shows up in a cameo, delivers a line about releasing a drive-by, and presumably went home wondering how his career arrived at that moment. Landis defended the film years later, claiming it found success on home video because parents bought it for their kids. At least there is that. Mr. Wrong was Ellen DeGeneres' first and, to this day, only leading role in a live-action film. Released in February 1996 by Touchstone Pictures, the romantic comedy paired her with Bill Pullman and carried a $19 million budget. It made $12.8 million worldwide. DeGeneres was paid a reported $2.2 million to headline the picture, and critics absolutely destroyed it. Siskel and Ebert gave two resounding thumbs down. The Washington Post called it a sour, listless debunking of romantic comedies. CinemaScore audiences gave it a brutal C-. But here is a detail most people do not know. Lisa Kudrow actually screen tested for the lead role. The film came out just months before DeGeneres made television history by coming out publicly on her sitcom. She later joked on her talk show that the movie deserved a sequel, which shows more grace than the film ever earned. Larger Than Life starred Bill Murray. It cost $30 million. It made $8.3 million. The premise was simple. Murray inherits an elephant and drives it across the country. That is the entire movie. Roger Ebert gave it 1.5 stars and wrote that Murray was so detached in the performance that he seemed almost absent. But what gets me every time is the timing. This film flopped in early November 1996. Just 2 weeks later, Murray popped up uncredited in Space Jam, which became a massive hit. That contrast, from elephant road trip disaster to cultural phenomenon cameo, perfectly marks the turning point in Murray's career. He quietly pivoted from big-budget studio comedies into indie work like Rushmore and eventually Lost in Translation, the performance that earned him an Oscar nomination. So, in a weird way, Larger Than Life might have been the best thing that ever happened to him. Also worth noting, a young Matthew McConaughey plays a deranged trucker in this movie, which remains arguably the most extreme character work of his entire career. And yes, that includes Dallas Buyers Club. Mary Reilly might be the single most expensive failure on this entire list, and almost nobody remembers it. Julia Roberts, one of the biggest stars on the planet, headlined this gothic retelling opposite John Malkovich. The budget hit $47 million. It made $12.9 million worldwide. When you factor in marketing and distribution, the estimated loss lands somewhere around $50 to $60 million. The production was a nightmare from start to finish. The script went through approximately 25 drafts. 3 different endings were filmed months after the original production wrapped. Glenn Close was flown back to England on the Concorde for a single day of work during reshoots. Roberts had a personal jet on standby in case she wanted to fly back to Los Angeles, which ran up a bill of roughly $120,000. Her Irish accent was compared by critics to the Lucky Charms leprechaun. By week 3 in theaters, the film had lost 87% of its screens. Director Stephen Frears was asked about it years later and said only one word: miraculous. When pressed on whether that meant he liked it, he simply repeated the word. You will not believe this one. Biodome starred Pauly Shore and Stephen Baldwin, cost $8.5 million to produce and another $10 million in marketing, and earned just $13.4 million worldwide. The numbers alone are bad enough, but the Metacritic score is what really stands out. Biodome received a 1 out of 100, making it one of only 10 films in the entire history of the site to receive that score. That is a special kind of terrible. But here is where the story gets genuinely strange. Alec Baldwin reportedly warned his brother Stephen that doing this movie could end his acting career. Stephen did it anyway. Then, after becoming a born-again Christian, Stephen Baldwin publicly claimed it was literally God's will that he destroyed his career with this film. He wrote that part of God's plan for his life was for him to ignore the advice of his managers and make a movie that was universally panned. I do not know if that is faith or the most creative excuse for a bad career move in Hollywood history, but I respect the commitment. Australian pop star Kylie Minogue has a supporting role, and later called it the only thing she has ever done that her father ridicules her for, which is saying something. Oh, and Jack Black and Kyle Gass make a brief appearance that was their first ever Tenacious D performance on screen. Barb Wire was Pamela Anderson's big screen debut, and it went about as well as you would expect. The budget was $9 million. Worldwide gross was $3.8 million. Here is the secret nobody mentions. The entire plot is a direct copy of Casablanca. Same structure, same beats, just set during a fictional Second Civil War in the year 2017. Anderson's manager told her not to play a cartoon character. She accepted the role without reading the script. During filming, her corset squeezed her waist down to 17 inches, making action sequences physically painful. On opening night, Anderson and Tommy Lee reportedly snuck into a regular theater to watch the audience react and heard only ridicule. The film swept the Razzies and was later ranked number 19 on the list of the 100 worst films of the entire 20th century. Multiplicity is the kind of movie that should have worked. Michael Keaton, Harold Ramis directing, a clever high concept about a man who clones himself. Columbia Pictures spent $45 million. It made about $37 million worldwide. But the real story is not the box office math. It is the technical achievement nobody saw. Boss Film Studios created pioneering motion control photography so Keaton could share the screen with himself. He kept detailed notes for each clone and even wore different scented colognes to help differentiate the characters between takes. And then there is what the crew called the $1 million miracle beer can toss. A take where one clone throws a beer to another that was executed so perfectly on set it did not need any digital correction. The problem was timing. Multiplicity opened against Independence Day, which was still dominating theaters, and competed directly with Eddie Murphy in The Nutty Professor, which also featured one actor playing multiple characters and earned $274 million. Sometimes a good movie just picks the wrong fight. Sergeant Bilko should have been Steve Martin's next franchise. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about what happens when the source material fights back. Universal Pictures spent $35 to $40 million on this adaptation of the classic Phil Silvers TV show. It grossed around $30 million domestically and essentially nothing overseas. But here is the detail that made this one special. The filmmakers approached the United States Army for production support, which is standard for military-themed films. The Army read the script and said no. An internal Army memo stated that every character in the film was either corrupt, corrupted, or witless. The producers responded by including a credit in the film that specifically thanked the Army for their total lack of support. I honestly love that level of pettiness. Phil Hartman, who gave one of his final memorable film performances here, steals every scene he is in, which makes the film's failure sting a little more in hindsight. The Phantom was supposed to launch a superhero franchise starring Billy Zane in a purple suit. Paramount spent $45 million. It made $17.3 million worldwide. Zane signed on for 2 sequels that were never produced. But the production has a few genuinely wild details. Hugh Hefner, a lifelong Phantom fan, allowed his Playboy mansion to be used as the Palmer family home, making this the only film in history ever granted permission to film there. Producer Joe Dante later publicly disowned the final cut, claiming the script was written to be funny, but was disastrously played straight. Bruce Campbell was originally pursued for the lead role, but executives felt he lacked box office appeal. Zane trained for over a year and a half, getting so muscular that a Batman-style fake muscle suit they had built became completely unnecessary. Catherine Zeta-Jones appeared in a supporting role. A reboot with Sam Worthington was briefly planned in 2008 but never materialized. The fan paired Robert De Niro and Wesley Snipes with director Tony Scott, who had just come off Crimson Tide. TriStar Pictures put up $55 million. It earned $42.2 million worldwide. That gap between cost and return was brutal, especially after factoring in marketing. The estimated loss sits somewhere between $25 and $35 million. But here is what stands out. Brad Pitt, Al Pacino, and Snipes all wanted the role of the obsessed fan that ultimately went to De Niro. The baseball sequences became infamous for continuity errors. Clips show the San Francisco Giants at bat while a Colorado Rockies catcher sits behind the plate. Candlestick Park transforms into Coors Field mid-scene. Those mistakes got so distracting that critics focused on them in reviews. The whole film was compared unfavorably to De Niro's masterful work in The King of Comedy, and that comparison was not kind. Chain Reaction was supposed to be the next great Keanu Reeves thriller. Director Andrew Davis had just made The Fugitive, one of the biggest hits of the 90s, and 20th Century Fox gave him $50 million and a cast that included Morgan Freeman and Rachel Weisz. Reeves collected $7 million plus 5% of first dollar gross. Domestic total came to $21.2 million. And here is why. 5 different screenwriters worked on the project with constant rewrites during filming. Brian Cox later wrote in his memoir that actors received only a beat script, which is basically a plot outline with no actual dialogue, and had to make up their lines on the spot. Cox recalled singing in an elevator because nobody had written him anything to say. Freeman later admitted the brutal Chicago winter shoot left him sick and bedridden for 4 days. 3 years later, Reeves starred in The Matrix and never looked back. The Island of Dr. Moreau is not just a box office disaster. It might be the greatest production meltdown in Hollywood history. New Line Cinema spent $40 million. It made $49.6 million worldwide, which sounds close to breaking even until you factor in the massive marketing spend and the fact that studios typically need 2 to 2.5 times the production budget to turn a profit. The estimated loss sits between $20 and $30 million, but the money is the least interesting part of this story. Director Richard Stanley spent 4 years developing this as his passion project. He was fired by Fax after just 3 days of filming, but instead of going home, Stanley put on a full animal creature costume, snuck back onto set, and hid among the extras to watch his own movie fall apart from the inside. Meanwhile, the cast was imploding. Bruce Willis had been attached but dropped out during personal issues. Val Kilmer replaced him, then immediately demanded his role be reduced by 40%. He received divorce papers between takes and became impossible to work with. Rob Morrow was cast as the lead but left in tears after 2 days. David Thewlis took over and reportedly shaved off half his mustache just to see if anyone would notice. And then there was Marlon Brando. After a devastating personal tragedy during production, Brando retreated to his private island and left the entire production in limbo. When he finally returned, he refused to learn any of his lines, demanding them fed through an earpiece. He showed up wearing white makeup, balanced an ice bucket on his head, and insisted a small performer named Nelson de la Rosa stand next to him at all times. He described the experience as trying to do a crossword while falling down an elevator shaft, which honestly might be the greatest quote about a bad movie ever spoken. What was supposed to be a 6-week shoot stretched to nearly 8 months. Ron Perlman arrived for a 3-week job and stayed 4.5 months. Roger Ebert called it perhaps Brando's worst film. And here is the kicker. A 2014 documentary about the making of this disaster, called Lost Soul, holds a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes. That is 75 points higher than the actual movie. Kazaam rounds out this list as the most recognizable disaster of 1996. Shaquille O'Neal played a genie who emerges from a boombox to grant wishes to a young boy. Touchstone Pictures spent $20 million. Shaq's salary alone was $7 million. The film earned $18.9 million worldwide. Rotten Tomatoes score, 5%. Shaq himself explained his decision to GQ magazine years later. He said he was a medium-level juvenile delinquent from Newark who always dreamed of doing a movie, and when somebody offered him $7 million to play a genie, he was not going to say no. Director Paul Michael Glaser, best known as Starsky from the original Starsky and Hutch, had only 10.5 weeks to get the screenplay written and greenlit because Shaq had to return to basketball camp. The script was finished in 6.5 weeks, but the legacy of Kazaam goes far beyond bad reviews. It became one of the most famous examples of the Mandela effect, a phenomenon where millions of people share a false memory. To this day, huge numbers of people insist they remember a movie called Shazam, starring comedian Sinbad as a genie, even though that film never existed. Sinbad himself has repeatedly pointed out that nobody his age has ever claimed to have seen it, only people who were kids in the 90s. So Kazaam did not just lose money. It somehow created a fake movie in the collective memory of an entire generation, which is honestly a more impressive achievement than anything that happened on screen. 15 films, over $300 million in combined losses. And the biggest single disaster was Mary Reilly, which lost an estimated $50 to $60 million despite starring Julia Roberts at the peak of her fame. But 1996 proved something the industry keeps forgetting. Star power does not guarantee ticket sales. Bruce Willis, Robert De Niro, Julia Roberts, Bill Murray, Keanu Reeves, Steve Martin. Every single one of them had a disaster that year. The real lesson is not that Hollywood gambles. It always has. The lesson is that in 1996, the house lost 15 times in a row.